What's up, fellas? Today we're going to be ranking the Conjuring movies from worst to best, and in Hitstart's case, from best to worst. Now, the Conjuring series is a supernatural horror franchise, which is by far one of the most successful, scary, and entertaining series of the 2010s. This series is widely loved by many, for good reason, including myself. It has impacted modern horror to the highest degree. These movies are often known for the dramatic and over-the-top jump scares, which sadly are often spoiled in the movie trailers. By far, one of the scariest elements of the Conjuring universe is that it's based on the real-life case of Ed and Lorraine Warren, whose story is displayed vaguely in the 7 films throughout the last decade. Now, Hitstart and I have chosen to exclude the Curse of La Llorona because it really isn't a part of the main Conjuring story, and it's so loosely connected that I don't think it's right to include it. From the 7 films, though, there are multiple direct sequels planned, such as The Devil Made Me Do It, which is continuing the main Conjuring series, the Nun sequel, which will expand on the Nun storyline from Conjuring 2, and also The Crooked Man, who first appears in the second Conjuring. I think it's going to be a direct sequel to The Curse of La Llorona. With all that backstory out of the way, Hitstart and I are going to go over the good, the bad, and the mediocre when it comes to the beloved Conjuring universe, as we rank this movies, which surprisingly fluctuate in quality. I mean, you guys will see how it goes from being an atrocious movie that I don't want to be anywhere near and is in my top 10 worst horror movies of all time, something that would probably be in my top 10 best horror movies of all time if I were to remake that list. So, with that all being said, let's get into that list. Coming in at number 6, we have the second installment of the Conjuring series, known as Annabelle. This was directed by John R. Leonetti, and it came out in 2014, about 15 months after the first Conjuring movie. Now, as you could probably tell by the title, this movie primarily focuses on the creepy-ass doll from the original, who's known as Annabelle. You see, Annabelle is a haunted doll, and they thought it would be a good idea to make a whole-ass movie on this concept. Sounds great, right? Well, it really wasn't. The sad part is it received really high box office numbers, which spawned 2 more Annabelle movies because of how much people actually liked it. I mean, honestly, I don't really want to talk about this movie too much, but the reason why it's so bad and why it's so low on this list is the combination of cheap jump scares, a bad storyline, overrated by many people, and it's overall just a bad movie. It's just about everything. I mean, I'd say the worst part is probably the storyline that seems so cheaply put together and rushed. I mean, I don't really know how to describe it because, as you can see later, the other 2 Annabelle movies are actually pretty good, and I'll admit, Annabelle is a pretty decent concept, but they just completely failed at this. It's not even a bad movie that you can just laugh at. It's kind of a movie that just makes you kind of sad. It just gets you all depressed inside, because, like, there's movies that are bad, like The Bye-Bye Man, but you'll still watch them just because they're, like, hilarious how bad they are. This is just a bad movie, and it's kind of depressing. Alright, on to number 5. We're going to take a step up, but not that big of a step, because speaking of movies that aren't enjoyable to watch, we have The Nun. Now, The Nun was directed by Corin Hardy and was a direct spin-off to the second Conjuring film. The Nun came out in 2018 and was unfathomably successful for how bad it was. This movie follows a demonic nun the entire time, which seems good on paper, but it really wasn't. Trust me on that. Don't go and watch it. One of the craziest things about this movie is that it actually has a sequel planned. I don't think many people are or should be surprised that this movie is so high on my list. It's shit. This movie is the perfect example of lazy writing and storytelling combined with overly dramatic jump scares and not scary antagonists. I mean, this movie just feels a little forced. Many people did enjoy this movie, which I guess is fair because I'd rather watch it than the Annabelle, which is a plus, but that's not saying much. My final thoughts on this movie are that it's really bad, but it's better than Annabelle, so that's why it's here. Alright, at number 4, we're taking a massive leap from atrocious to actually good movies. Now, all the movies from now on are really good, and we're going to start with Annabelle Creation. Annabelle Creation came out in 2017 and was directed by David F. Sandberg. This movie was actually a good watch. It started as a direct prequel to the original Annabelle movie, and ended up being an origin story for the creepy-ass doll Annabelle. This movie brought us a lot of hope for the series and made me think about how truly awesome the Conjuring universe can be at its best. Many people were turned off by the first Annabelle, rightfully so, and did not watch this, but those who did were rewarded with a very interesting and well-thought plotline as the unsuspecting characters slowly encounter the dangers of the malicious intent of the creepy doll. I think this movie accomplishes exactly what it wants to, which makes it simple. It's an enjoyable backstory which all Conjuring fans can enjoy. This movie was also able to produce one of the highest grossing box office revenues in the entire Conjuring series. Overall, I think this movie was a pretty cool watch and almost makes you forget about the first Annabelle movie. Number 3 is Annabelle Comes Home, and it's actually the most recent of all these movies. It came out in 2019 and was directed by Gary Doberman. A lot of Conjuring fans think Creation is better than this, but I actually enjoyed this movie more. It was my favorite of the Annabelle trilogy. This movie follows the Warrens a lot more than any of the other Annabelle movies, which means we get to see more awesome acting from Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga. This movie follows a simple yet interesting plotline which sees the Warrens' daughter left home with a babysitter for the weekend. They encounter and are terrorized by Annabelle the entire time. This plot makes for an interesting scary movie with alright jump scares and great acting, but by far the best part of this movie is Annabelle, who actually proves to be an interesting, creepy antagonist. Overall, this movie did really well in the box office, and it's a really fun watch that I highly recommend. The second best Conjuring movie is going to be Conjuring 2. It came out in 2016, just 3 years after the original, and was able to produce a great box office draw with a larger budget and the return of the renowned horror director James Wan. This movie has a shift in plot, and it was brought to England and featured a new family of a single mom and her 4 children. Upon discovering malicious spirits, Patrick and Lorraine Warren are brought to try to help them out. The jump scares are the best in the entire series as they don't take themselves too seriously, and I really enjoyed the new demonic entities like the Nun and the Crooked Man are definitely some of the scariest antagonists in any of these movies. Too bad the spin-off for the Nun did not go as planned. Now, the movie was much more sinister than the original and was able to prove to be a great sequel, which is actually really rare in the horror industry. To be honest, I really enjoyed this movie and some parts more than the first movie, but I do think that there is one obvious movie that is better than Conjuring 2, and that is the original Conjuring. Now that transition was not as cool as I thought it would be, but the original Conjuring came out in 2013 and was directed by James Wan. This movie instantly proved to be a classic with its supernatural horror elements. Honestly, this movie doesn't need an explanation as it had a massive impact on the horror genre, but I'll give it anyways. The Conjuring follows a nice family that moves into a haunted house that is twisted and has a terrible backstory. Upon being terrorized by demonic entities, they get the Warrens involved in an absolute thriller of a movie. This film is super creative and very well shot. That, combined with its great cast, makes for the best movie in the Conjuring series, and one of the best horror movies of all time. There is a reason this movie has spawned 6 sequels, with 3 more on the way, and that's because of its popularity and jump scares. Overall, this movie is awesome and by far the best in the series. The box office draw on this movie was absolutely crazy, but this is an amazing movie, and now I think it's time to go on to Hitstart's rankings.
Okay, so here's my list for the Conjuring movies ranked. For the number 1 spot, I will say that I didn't find this movie the scariest out of all of them, but overall I thought The Conjuring 2 was the most enjoyable. Now there were of course a lot of scary scenes. Some of the best ones were the first few times we saw the nun, who's the main villain of the movie. Of course we all got relatively quickly tired of that once the full nun movie came out. But the first time it did work, especially because when you initially see her, it's not an in-your-face jump scare but a few creepy scenes that have a great build-up of tension. My favorite one of these was when Lorraine saw the nun in her hallway. But what was really good to see was that throughout the story you get more closely attached to the family, in my opinion much more so than the first one. And since we already know the Warrens at this point, we care a lot more about them. And one thing that the Conjuring movies do so well is that although they manage to be very scary, they also usually have a happy ending, which is quite refreshing to see since most horror movies end very badly for the main characters. Next up for me is 2013's The Conjuring. It was definitely scarier than the second one, however all the scares were spoiled in the trailers, so all the great scenes, like the laundry sheet scene or the hide and clap moment or the part where the mother was locked in the basement, none of it feels new when you see it. It would have been much better if they didn't give away most of the scares in the trailers, especially because a lot of them are really creative and feel very unconventional compared to a simple jump scare. Still, I love the mystery aspect of the movie, because for a long time you don't quite know what's going on. You see a lot of strange faces and many evil spirits, and throughout the story you get a better understanding of who they are and why they're here. And that's probably its biggest strength. The movie doesn't reveal the main villain until the end, and that final showdown between the Warrens and the Bathsheba spirit was pretty epic. However, it also made me question how much of these stories is actually true. In the number 3 spot is Annabelle Creation. This was probably the biggest surprise because the first Annabelle wasn't that well received, which set the expectations for the sequel pretty low. But then it turned out to be an entertaining movie that had some very solid scary moments. There are actually a few subtle parts where you can kinda see the demon lurking in the darkness, and the movie leaves it to you to figure it out, which I thought was pretty cool. It also didn't rely on a bunch of fake jump scares in the first half of the movie, which a lot of films do even though nobody likes it. Overall, it did have a little bit of a slower build-up, so if you don't care about the characters, you might not like it too much. But it did do a great job of providing a backstory to the Annabelle doll. Among my favorite moments in the film is when one of the caretakers finds a photo of a bunch of nuns, and you can just barely kind of see the evil Valak demon in the background. I really liked that. Okay, so for the next one, I know this will be very unpopular, but for me it's The Nun. And okay, look, I know everyone hated it, but honestly, I didn't think it was that bad. Yes, it's not a great piece of cinema by any means, but if you sit down and merely expect a spooky jumpscare fest that reminds you of a Universal Studios ride, that's pretty much exactly what you're gonna get. They clearly focused on making a lot of scares, most of which were relatively unexpected, and luckily the story moved along really fast, because it clearly wasn't what most of the younger audiences came for. So if you know exactly what you're in for, I think you can enjoy this movie for what it is. It was also interesting to see how the last few moments lead into the main story of Ed and Lorraine Warren, which was quite unexpected. Now I think it's kind of a shame that this demon didn't get a better horror story, because everyone was freaking out about the character of the nun when they saw it. I remember when the first trailer came out and people were scared just looking at that, but I guess you can't always get what you want. Next up is Annabelle Comes Home, which is the third Annabelle movie, and even though we're towards the bottom of the list here, I still enjoyed this movie. One of the most interesting aspects of it was that the story further explored the Warrens' basement where they keep all the haunted items. This was something that we saw in the first Conjuring movie, and it always felt a little bit like a ticking time bomb. You have all of these evil objects sitting in one room. I mean, if something goes wrong, there will be a couple of dozen demons in one house. And that's pretty much what happens here. Usually when you hear the words cursed objects, it sounds a little bit strange, but this movie surprisingly managed to pull it off. And with the creepy setting of the Warrens' house, there is a lot of tension successfully built up. The only thing that I would have liked to see more of was the Warrens. However, I do have to say that this movie did that thing that a lot of people always complain about, and it's that entire scenes are built around jump scares. This unfortunately made them kind of predictable because a lot of scenes went down in a similar way. So the number 6 spot is Annabelle, and it's in last place. This is the movie that had so much potential, but unfortunately didn't use any of it. We were all rooting for it to be good, but it just wasn't. Now in case you forgot, the first Conjuring movie actually started out with the Annabelle case, and those few minutes were so effective that the doll instantly became just as infamous as Chucky and the Billy puppet from Saw. But the full feature-length movie we got a year later didn't do much to build on that. The movie just felt extremely slow, and by the time things finally started happening, it was far too little, far too late. Annabelle made what's in my eyes the biggest mistake a horror film can do. It was really boring and didn't pay off. It seemed like they knew that people were going to buy tickets regardless because of the creepy doll, so their only concern was to make it as cheaply as possible to maximize return. So that's the order I'd put them in. Let me know if you agree.
And that's our rankings. If you agree with either of us, let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to try to release another Genius Behind later this week. I'm going to try to be releasing more consistently. Oh, and for those who are wondering, I would put probably The Curse of La Llorona between Creation and The Nun. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching and stay cool, fellas.